Is the so-called war on drugs a failure? Depends on who you ask. Some people would say that it succeeded in stopping some drugs and is therefore a partial success. However, more and more people are pointing out that drug use and violence in this country have both increased as the budget for the so-called war on drugs increases. If the purpose of the so-called war on drugs is to stop the cultivation, manufacture, distribution, and use of currently illegal drugs, then yes, it has been a monstrous, cruel, and embarrassing failure. This observation is currently being made in wider and wider circles, from publications as diverse as the Communist Party USA's People's Weekly World to the right-wing pseudo-intellectual journal National Review, and everywhere in between. All this begs the question, though, why do we have a so-called war on drugs if it's such an inhuman, expensive, and abysmally unsuccessful program? Are the president and the rest of the people in government really that stupid? Do they go around spending billions and billions of dollars because they don't know what they're doing? Is the government really run by incompetence? At this point, some people would be saying, of course they're incompetent. Look around you. And that logic is persuasive to some. After all, the country is falling apart, and the government's only response is to cut aid to the poor and lock up more and more people. But I personally don't think that Bill Clinton and company are stupid. A little foolish because of arrogance, maybe. They certainly are cruel and uncaring, and some of them are downright evil. But not stupid. What if we just supposed that the purpose of the so-called war on drugs was to keep drug profits high for the people who run Colombia and Peru, to help finance covert operations by the CIA, to artificially support the petrochemical and paper industries by outlawing viable natural alternatives like hemp, and to lock up untold hundreds of thousands of otherwise ordinary citizens, most of whom happen to be black and or poor. If these were the purposes of the so-called war on drugs, then we would all have to concede that it has been a triumphant success. Drug money does help prop up Colombia. Drug money is used by the CIA to help finance covert wars against democracy and people around the world. Dow Chemical is secure in the knowledge that hemp, paper, and fibers are still illegal, and we did recently pass the 1.1 million Americans in prison milestone. Perhaps the so-called war on drugs is really a humongous success, and that is why the government keeps extending it. They aren't stupid, they're just lying about their purposes. You see, a lot of people have this view that if things go wrong, at least wrong vis-a-vis the official plan, that it is because of an accident or stupidity. Like when Iraq invaded Kuwait after the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, one April Glaspie, acting on instructions from the State Department, led Saddam Hussein to believe that the U.S. would remain neutral if Iraq were to invade. Accident or setup? I know people who argue that it was an accident, that Glaspie is just incompetent. Maybe. But no. The accidental theory of history, as I like to call it, is very popular in this country. It's easier for people to believe that Clinton is just foolish for continuing the so-called war on drugs, rather than admit to themselves that the whole thing is a cheap rationalization for locking up the poor and secretly funding government activities which the people would otherwise not support, like raping nuns in Nicaragua. The American people just don't go in for that sort of thing. So if we all pretend that the so-called war on drugs is well-intentioned, then we don't have to be outraged at this evil that is actually done intentionally. Society is collapsing around us. Are we going to continue to respond to poverty by locking up hundreds of thousands of people on petty drug charges? Are we going to continue to allow the petrochemical and timber industries to destroy the earth rather than decrease their profits by using an alternative like hemp? Are we going to continue to allow the CIA and military intelligence to put down democratic movements all over the world and support corrupt, capital-friendly dictatorships with the profits from the sale of cocaine and heroin? It's time we just admitted that the so-called war on drugs is not an accident, but really a war on working people, especially people of color and poor people. In spite of all the drug war programs, marijuana is still the biggest cash crop in California and Hawaii. We should be taxing it, using the money for public health and education programs. Legalization is actually easy, and it has to be done. The alternative is quite obviously far, far more destructive than the drugs themselves. The hard part will be banning advertising for all drugs, especially alcohol and tobacco, the real killers. That's the real solution, you know. Make all drugs legal to have and to sell, but not to advertise.
Richard Curtis with our commentary this morning. It's 8:30 at Boulder County Community Radio.